Hi, my name is Jordan. I am a special education teacher from the UK. I share my passion for everything communication, sensory regulation, and fun lesson ideas for my classroom of disabled pupils aged 4 to 11. Each week, I am joined by experts in the field, answering your questions and sharing our knowledge and experience working alongside our beautiful young people. Let's get started. Hello everybody and welcome back to the Sensory Classroom podcast. Today I am joined by Richard, who's from SOS SEN, which is a supporting service for parents to support with the process, the paperwork, the understanding of everything to do with SEN as far as I can see from your website. Hello Richard.
Hello, Jordan. Thank you for having us.
You are so welcome. When your team reached out, I was so pleased because I think about 99% of messages I get is about the EHCP process or diagnosis. It's a whole new world, and lots of parents are kind of brought into this world and jumped in the deep end, and all these acronyms and everything. It's really confusing.
Yes,
Hence
it's
why
quite
we
terrifying.
absolutely, and all this, medical jargon and all these words and therapists all of a sudden included, or if you're lucky, they're included, I suppose. And it can be very overwhelming, and that kind of doesn't seem to stop either. I've got parents of teenagers, and they're still navigating the system and the process and learning things.
Yeah, it's one of those incredibly frustrating situations where you think just because you've been successful with getting an assessment and getting the EHCP, you almost think that that's it, it's done. And sadly, that is just so far from the truth in so many instances. And there's another battle to be done, and now a transition and an annual review. And it's so overwhelming for so many people who had no idea that they were about to embark on this level of a journey and a battle.
Absolutely. So let's just talk about SOS SEN and what you offer parents.
So we are a charity that's been running for over 20 years. Primarily, it was set up in Richmond to support a school there, but it's grown. The variety of services that we offer, we've got a number of services for free. So we have a free helpline where people can call and speak to one of our advisors for sort of 20, 30 minutes and ask for next steps guidance. We have several advice centres, which are walk-in centres where people can come along, bring their paperwork, talk to us about their situations. Again, they'll be with an advisor for 30, 40 minutes, talk through their case and find out their next steps. Again, that's free. And then we offer document writing services. So we've talked about EHCPs. When those come through to you, we've identified that local authorities, intentionally or unintentionally, they will put some language and wording in there that isn't actually helpful or isn't going to hold anyone to account. And what our team does is we will go through that report and we will pick out all of that sort of unhelpful language and we will help to rewrite that EHCP so as it is geared up to ensure that that child gets equitable education. There are a number of reasons why local authorities will either refuse to assess or refuse to issue EHCPs and put blockages in place. And parents then need to appeal those decisions. So we will help them to write grounds of appeals, and our team will support them in doing that. The other thing that we do as well is pre-action protocol letters or judicial review letters. So if a local authority are not quite acting lawfully, our team will put letters together that have been created by our legal officer, Eleanor Wright, who's got over 25 years of SEN law experience. She will write those letters that we can send across to the local authorities and just remind them of their lawful duties. We've found thus far in the last year that's had a 97% success rate at getting local authorities to overturn decisions.
Wow.
So they're kind of a good selection of things that we do. The bulk of what we're looking to do is to empower families so as they can navigate this really complicated system, and ensure that all children and young people get equitable education. That's our hope and plan.
Absolutely. And in the world as it should be, charities like yours shouldn't have to exist, right? Every child should be in education. They should be getting appropriate and suitable education. They should have their legal needs and educational needs and health needs met. You know, so many jobs that charities do should just be being done right. It breaks my heart that how
Yeah.
needed, and your charity is, my goodness, is it needed. Yeah, it kind of breaks my heart that it even should exist, really.
I couldn't agree more, and I often say it's one of the weirdest sensations to lead an organisation like this, because for a measure of success, what I really want is my success is that our charity has to close down because we're not needed
Yeah.
anymore, which is the weirdest thing to say. But actually, I think it's horrific that a charity like ours has to exist. I'm pleased that we are there and that we can help and that we will continue to help. But I think it's dreadful that we have to even exist in order to do it. It's a shame.
Yeah, absolutely. So you were talking about the free call-ins. What kind of questions are you regularly getting from? Is it mainly parents?
It's largely sort of parents and carers. From time to time, we'll get calls from Senkos or other
Mm-hmm.
professionals just saying, I don't know how, like, what do I need to do to support this family, or how can I navigate them to you? But largely it's parents and carers. And what we tend to find is a lot of the calls are around EHCPs. It's very much a case of, my child has these needs and I need to get the support in place, but how do I do that? And often we are saying, do they have an EHCP? And we hear so many people saying, no, the school have told us that we don't need one or that we don't qualify for one. And the legal test to qualify for an EHCP is actually, it's a really, I'm going to say it's a low bar, in the sense of, may this child have any special educational needs and may they benefit from any additional support in class? If the answer to those two things is yes, qualify for an EHCP. So when we hear schools and local authorities saying no, they don't qualify, you're like, have they put any different provision in place? Yes. Does your child have any additional needs? Yes. Right. Then the answer is yes.
It's not even
um,
diagnosed additional needs, is it? I know that they you can have an EHCP without a diagnosis, can't you? And I think that's often a misconception is, oh, but we're on the pathway for, say, an autism diagnosis. It's going to take 4 years, so we can't get an EHCP until then, and that's just not the case, is it?
it's not, no, and you don't need that formal diagnosis, because again, it's the language that's used within the law. May the child have any additional needs or special educational needs? It, it does not state, does this child have, or what special educational needs does this child have? So it's really, really vague for the right reasons. So yeah, they don't need the formal diagnosis. Obviously, that helps, but the local authorities should be putting provisions in place to do their own assessments to help families with that as well.
Should should
Should,
should
yes.
should be. Um,
Lawfully, they absolutely should, and that's what we have to remind them of.
Yeah, yeah, and they are overrun, underfunded, understaffed as well, right? But I know that's not an excuse. They need to do their legal obligation, just as we all do. But yeah, that is why, isn't it? And it's not just schools that can apply for EHCPs, is it? Parents can put in that initial referral, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So to apply for any HCP, it can be either the school or the parent. There are merits to doing it both ways. You tend to find that if you are doing it through the school, then you've got a bit more backing, and the local authority might pay more attention. But each local authority is different. But yeah, if you're finding that your school isn't prepared to put that sort of submit that paperwork and put that through, then absolutely parents can do that independently.
Maybe a little bit with that. Maybe that's where your support comes in as well. Maybe it needs to be worded in a maybe slightly different way, or you to add certain things in there.
Yeah, and we've got a whole backlog of back catalogue of webinars, and in there we did a webinar on, I think it's called the Send 35 form, which is essentially applying for those things. And it's, I don't know if that's applying for the tribunal. I'm not the one who's legally trained,
Yeah.
um, but we've done an awful lot of support on our webinars on how to apply for EHCPs, what should it look like, how to apply to tribunal. Like all of those things are there to just again further empower the families.
I can imagine it's really helpful because even when you get the EHCP, it's such a massive document of lots and lots of different words. Like I said at the beginning, lots of different acronyms, and it's the legal requirement. So, as a parent, I can imagine, and as a teacher, I certainly feel it. You want to get it right, but when you've got 15 days to check that it's all right, it can be a real huge pressure,
Mm.
and lots of things can get missed. Are there any
Yeah.
things that you particularly, any areas of the EHCP that you would particularly focus on, or you would ensure that we had in place, or is it kind of different for every child?
I think it's very, very different for every child, and I think it's important that within that plan, all of the needs are identified, clearly identified, and then any provisions that are being put in place need to be essentially they need to follow the SMART model, and they need to be incredibly specific. We see an awful lot of times in EHCPs there's very vague language used, so this child may benefit from a one-to-one. You go, well, sure, they may.
Yeah,
Are
because
they
they don't want to
getting
commit, because they don't want to
it?
commit to
Yeah.
needing it. Because if you say somebody needs something in the EHCP, then it's a legal obligation. Is that accurate? They should
It's
then.
essentially, yeah, it means that you can then hold the school to account and say, because again, what we would do is we would then say, how many hours one-to-one does this child need? And who is going to be that one-to-one? And then it would be how many hours are they putting that in place? Who is managing that? Who's training it? We make that very, very specific and we put all of those things in place. And essentially we help families to make sure that language is there so as they can then hold the school to account and saying, well, hold on,
Yeah.
you've told me that for 10 hours a week, my child's going to get one-to-one by a trained autism friendly specialist. And I know that last week they only had 5 hours and that's consistent. What's going on?
Yeah.
It means that they can then hold the school to account
Yeah.
for those things.
Absolutely. So for those that are listening that haven't heard of SMART targets before, they need to be specific, they need to be measurable, they need to be achievable, they need to be realistic, and they need to be timed. So by timed, it means to be given us to a certain date. So by the time they're in year one, or by the time they leave key stage 2, or next term, whatever it is, they need to be timed. And that's what a SMART target is. And you're absolutely right. It keeps the school and it keeps the county and it keeps the young person and the parents all accountable, doesn't it,
Yeah.
to achieving these things?
And I think actually it's exactly that. It keeps everyone to account and it gives everyone a fair and reasonable understanding of what are we looking for? What are we hoping to achieve from doing this? And if we review this next year and no progress has been made, but all of the provisions have been put in place, well, then we know we did all of those things right, but that didn't get the desired outcome. So what needs to change? And it just helps us to kind of log that and move those thoughts forward.
In that view, actually, sometimes as a teacher, because I'm somebody that writes the EHCP, so I'm kind of on the other side of it, and sometimes my young people don't achieve the target in the given time, but all the provision is in place. And sometimes it is a bit of guesswork as to how far they can get in that given time frame. I've also had children that have way out past it, and you look back and think, why did I write that target? You're way ahead. So it is an estimate, isn't it? And we can only guess and make assumptions, or with the team around the child, with the parents, with the therapist, whoever's involved. It's a best guess as to, by the time they're in this, with all this support in place, we hope, or we believe that they could achieve
Yeah,
this, isn't it?
and I think it's not being afraid to admit actually that progress wasn't made, but the provision was in place. essentially we have to accept there is no box tick here. It's oh, this young person has autism and that young person has autism. That does not mean that those two people are going to follow the exact same
Yeah.
path in their education. But that's the same for any human being, right? We all have unique elements and factors coming into our lives, and we all learn differently. So I think you're absolutely right. You could look at that child and go, based on the assessments, based on my understanding, based on my skills, I believe if we put these things in place, we will be able to achieve these things. Then reflecting and saying, we did put those things in place and it didn't work.
Yeah.
I think we need to feel safe and confident that that can happen. And a lot of the work that we do with parents is about building that relationship with school, not kind of marching through the doors and banging on the doors and saying, you've messed up. You need to have a good relationship with schools and say, what else can we do? Are there any other training sessions? Are there any other sort of models that we can adopt? All things like that
Yeah.
to kind of acknowledge that if everyone's pulling in the right direction, that's when we'll see progress for that child.
Yeah, and maybe use the EHCP review as a opportunity to be curious about why that wasn't achieved. Was it achievable in the first place? Maybe it wasn't a smart target.
Mm,
Maybe they've had lots of medication complications, or hospital visits, or maybe they've had a bout of sickness, or maybe they've had a change in key worker. Like, there's lots of different reasons why a child might not achieve a target, and it's really important to put that on there as well, isn't it? Because that gives a real great reflection in the EHCP review as you're reviewing it, to be curious why didn't they, or why did they completely like blow
yeah,
this target out of the water? Were we being too limited in our expectations of this child, and to reflect on that as well.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's beauty, and that's how it should be. We should always be curious about what's happening for our children, what they need, what's working, what's not working, and if we kind of have that baseline of where they're at, and then when things aren't there, what's happening? How can we help? And I noticed that when it comes to the afternoon sessions, that's when they're struggling to focus. So what's happened between now and then? What's something that we might be able to put in place to support them? Um, and I think we need to accept and we need to acknowledge and give credit to teachers as well, because they're in a room with 30 children. Uh,
33 sometimes by themselves,
yeah,
yeah.
and they are dealing with 30 plus individuals, all with personalities, all with home lives, all with emotional sort of mental health, physical health, like all of those needs are there and they're coming into that room. To ask a teacher, even if that teacher has an additional support in the room, to ask that teacher to have an acute awareness of every single one of those people and to constantly know every single thing and get every single thing right, that's a big ask. Okay. And we have to acknowledge that sometimes teachers are allowed to be human too. They're allowed to make those errors. But again, we go back to what support is in place and is everyone trying to pull together for the right sort of
Yeah,
end
I think
result?
I think lots of teachers love their pupils and love the job and definitely want to do what's best for their pupils. I don't think there are many teachers that don't go into this job for the right reasons, absolutely. But also, there's very little training for us, and I don't think parents understand that. I'm a special education teacher now, but I was primary school teacher trained, and we didn't talk about EHCPs in my training.
No.
We didn't talk about special education in my training. We spoke about dyslexia. So I just want parents to know as well that teachers are very much relying on the Senko, and the Senko is very much relying on their like little training as well. There is, don't assume that the teachers just know this stuff and are taught this stuff and are choosing not to do it. They might genuinely not know, and that's not through lack of care. It's just through lack of
The,
training, really.
the world of disability and special educational needs is constantly growing and evolving. I've worked within the world of special educational needs. I've worked within that field within the last 10 to 12 years. Um, it's only when I started working at SOS SEN that I started to learn a lot more about neurodiversity. I'd never, and this isn't a special education needs, I'd never heard of the term AOTUS, education other than at school. And I was like, okay, what is this? What do I need to learn? We are now identifying so many forms of neurodiversity, and we're celebrating that as we should. We are also finding that a lot of adults are late diagnosed with neurodiversity, and they are looking going, actually, I've navigated the system, but here's some of those things. So we are constantly learning, constantly evolving. And I think, again, if we are curious about that and feel safe to get it wrong, because as we are learning, we're going to use language that hasn't quite landed, and it's kind of evolving. I know certainly with my work, there's a number within my team that self-identify and have diagnosis of neurodiversity, and I'm learning about those things, and I'm learning what measures I can put in place to sort of make
To
reasonable
support them.
adjustments
Yeah.
to support them.
Right.
And I think we need to feel safe to be able to do that and to learn and to ask those questions and to be able to, and I think continue to build that relationship between school and teacher and parent, and say, actually, I'm really curious about autism. I've never experienced autism before. Could you come and
Yeah.
actually talk to me about it? I'd love to learn. I know certainly from my own personal experiences, I'm an adoptive parent, and quite often we would have to go into the schools and spend time with the teachers and say, I'd like to talk to you about adoption. I'd like to talk to you about children in care and some of their own sort of challenges, difficulties, or traumas that may affect their behaviour in the classroom.
I think
And the
that's
team,
wonderful because the parents, because it's an open, safe conversation, isn't it? And ultimately, as the parent, you're not only supporting your own child in that class, but you're supporting all future children
yeah,
that
yeah,
teacher may come across. I think that's a
yeah.
wonderful thing to do.
I think so, and I think the more that families can do that and they can get involved in their schools, there were times even in our own journey where I met some teachers that they're disengaged. They weren't interested in learning about adoption trauma and what that meant. And you understand, you get frustrated, and you go, okay, that's not the one I'm going to win. But then other teachers welcomed us into the space and asked an abundance of questions. So when you're in that environment, and if you have that relationship, harbour it and throw everything you've got at that relationship, because that's how you not only help your child, but you help, like you say, Jordan, you're going to help generations of children. And those teachers might then influence other teachers. And that's how we grow. That's how we learn, by just continuing to learn in our own sort of world what this means and how it impacts us and how it impacts somebody else, and trying as best as we can to understand the empathy of how is this going to feel for that child. And
Absolutely.
they're not just being difficult. They're not just trying to misbehave just because isn't that fun.
No.
I mean,
I wish I was wearing my
obviously that
t-shirt
is.
I was wearing yesterday. Yesterday I was wearing my no such thing as naughty jumper, which would have
Nice.
been quite good in this conversation because there
Yeah.
absolutely is no such thing as naughty. Have you, as a charity, noticed an increase in need? Because everyone's talking about, you know,
Yeah.
overdiagnosis. Everyone's autistic these days, and I'm sure you can guess what I think about that. But have you noticed, as a charity, an increase in this need?
Yeah. So the year prior to me coming on board, so between 22 to 23, our charity supported around about 1,200 families. Last financial year, so between 23 to 24, that went up to 3,400 families that we supported. This year alone, we're already on target to help 5,200. Yeah, so we've seen an exponential growth in this. We
So do
think
you
that,
think, I was going to say, what contributes towards that? Because I'm sure it's probably a few factors, isn't it?
yeah, I think it's a number of factors. I think by and large, I think people's awareness is growing.
Yeah.
I think people are starting to understand what rights they have, and they are talking more with other families and saying, well, what is an EHCP? How do I get one? What's the purpose? What's the point? Um, we are also, like I said earlier, we're finding more adults are becoming self-aware of their own neurodiversity. As a result, they are then understanding that and saying, I wonder if my child might be struggling with school because of X. So we've got a better global awareness of the various forms of neurodiversity. Um, it's not that we have more neurodiverse individuals
Yeah.
today than we did 10 years ago. It's that we see those signs and understand what those behaviors mean. And now we can go, right, if we put X, Y, and Z in place, that's just going to make life a tiny bit easier. Um, so, yeah. I think that's a huge contributing factor. I think people are just becoming so much more aware of a whole array of needs in themselves, in their young people, and they are then speaking with others and forming part of those communities. And you could argue that this is one of the very few benefits of social media, where
Mm.
people are talking and we're actually building communities where people can actually share those behaviors and say, I'm seeing this behavior in my child, and someone goes, me too. Have
Yeah.
you had this assessment? Have you checked this? And we're just learning better, and we're
Yeah,
learning
you get
what we
access
can
to
ask.
a whole world of therapists and special education teachers and charities that are talking about this stuff. And because of how the algorithm works, it kind of feeds it to the right people.
Mm,
And yeah, and you can learn a lot, can't
yeah.
you?
Oh, absolutely. And there's just a wealth of knowledge out there if you're prepared to kind of take the time to learn it. And now so many parents are knowing that they can do that, and they know how to access it, which is fantastic.
Yeah, and they're feeling empowered to question the
Mm,
system. I felt like maybe before, maybe even just 10 years ago, it would be the teachers that would approach the parents about their neurodiverse children, or children with a cognitive disability, or, whatever it was. Whereas now I feel like the tables have turned, and it is very often now parents that are approaching that conversation initially, even sometimes pre-nursery, saying, my child isn't meeting these
yeah.
steps or is doing these things. I think it might be this.
Yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. And I think the relationship as well is changing between parent and school. I often talk about the first time I walked into our son's classroom. I was like, well, the last time I was in a classroom, I was a pupil and the teacher was God, and I wasn't allowed to question anything that they said. And it can feel quite intimidating when you disagree with this person, because you're like, well, this normally ends up in detention. um, so that relationship has got to change, and you've also got to have that faith and trust in that system. And then when you learn, actually, sometimes that doesn't quite come to fruition, you then learn that you've got to be that advocate for your child, and you've got to fight for their rights, which you don't necessarily expect.
Yeah.
So
I
again, I
think
think
I
that's
think how
changing.
parenting and teaching is going. I think all of childcare has developed lots in the last 10 to 20 years. It's very much not the adult's way is the right way, and children sit and listen, and they're like their vessels
Yeah,
to be filled. It's not that. It's
yeah.
much more collaborative. It's much more child led. It's much more
Mm,
awareness of emotions, more emotionally intelligent teaching, trauma led teaching. I'd like to hope anyway, and I think the teaching training is slowly catching up with that. We were about 5 years, 10 years behind, maybe. But it certainly is how children are being brought up now, isn't it? Is to be emotionally led, child led. We're much more aware of the impact on those early years now. I would like to say, as a whole, this is a very sweeping statement, but as a whole of adults, we're much more aware than we were 10 or 20 years ago. And that's going to have an impact on education, isn't it? It's going to have an impact on how parents are parenting their children, therefore how they would like their children to be educated,
yeah.
and all of that.
But I think you're absolutely right, and I think the more that we learn, the better informed that we become, and the better practices that we start to put in place. Being the charity that we are, we have We have just under 100 volunteers working with us. A lot of those are SEN parents themselves, and a high portion of those volunteers also identify as having some form of special educational need themselves. As a charity, what I've done is I've taken the lead there to make sure that our environment is that of a special educational needs friendly environment. So we've changed a lot of our practices internally to make sure that all reasonable adjustments have been made to meet the needs of all individuals. As such, I'm having those conversations with my peers in other organizations, and I'm saying an example is when it comes to us interviewing anyone, I will send the interview questions in advance. So as that person can do some proper prep time, and we get the best from them. And it's coming out in research that for a neurodiverse individual, that is the ideal way for them to go through an interview process. As a result, I'm starting to see my peers in other organisations following that pattern and doing those things. So we're all growing, we're all learning, and we're all moving that way. So absolutely, I think you're right that as we learn, so many more environments will be changing, and we will become neurodiverse friendly in all of the ways that we operate to ensure that, because when I do that and it's helpful for someone with any form of neurodiversity, it's not something that's then unhelpful for a neurotypical
Yes.
person.
Yeah.
It's the same as what we say, if you are in a room and you are trauma informed and you are putting trauma informed teaching in place, it's not that the children who have not gone through trauma are going, well, I feel left out because you don't care about, like, you care too much about my emotional needs. Everyone benefits when we start to put those sort of checks and measures in place and that support in place. So yeah, I think it will be a ripple effect.
I really hope so. I really hope so. They're definitely still. Maybe I'm just in this bubble, like an echo chamber, but it certainly feels like it's ramping up. That everybody that is aware is kind of buzzing and rippling. It's all rippling out. It really does feel like change
Yeah,
is happening, which is incredibly exciting for me.
yeah,
So we've
yeah, I
spoken a
agree.
lot about the initial EHCP process as far as if they haven't got one. But of course, lots of parents listening to this will already have a child with an EHCP, but it doesn't stop, does it? It's still checking if it's accurate, relevant, legal requirement. I know we spoke about legal requirements before, and I meant to say that it's not a legal requirement that they meet the target. It's just a legal requirement that the provision is in place in order to meet the target. I meant to say that earlier because I don't know if I'm made that clear. But also, I noticed on your website that you do a lot around phase transfers, which is a huge thing in itself. Moving from early years to primary and primary to secondary and
Yeah.
secondary to adult learning. And that often brings a lot of anxiety for
Mm,
families because
yeah.
they might have just felt like they've got everything right. The child is settled. I've finally got this adult that understands my child. My child is happy in school. We've fought all the fights. And then they're year 6 and all of a sudden they've got or year 5 actually, and they've got to apply for secondary schools.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
do you get a
It's
lot of parents at these stages
yeah.
coming in contact as well?
Yeah, so we find, in particular, we find the February, the month of February after phase transfer for secondary, we see a huge spike in our helpline and our advice centre attendance and things like that because people are like, what do I do? How do I cope with this? And it's incredibly terrifying for so many families because, like you say, they've the child has become as settled as they can be. They've learnt the environment, they've learnt the teacher learnt them, and they feel safe. And finally, when they feel safe, all of the adults around them are going, brilliant. Now let's change it all again. It's like quadruple the size of people that are around you. And,
Yeah.
and instead of that one or two teachers, let's give you 10. And instead of that one teacher having 30 to 35 students, now that one teacher's got, what, 150 a day? So
Yeah.
everything is ramped up and amplified, and the fear and the anxiety that
Yeah.
follows that is huge, understandably so. So
I think
yeah,
for any
keep.
parent, let alone SEN, like
Yeah,
for any parent,
yeah.
that year 6 to year 7 transition is huge because the parents don't walk them to the gate. The parents aren't as involved with the teacher. They don't get the same communication level. There
Mm.
is higher expectation. So any child will be feeling those anxieties, but add special educational needs onto that, and anxiety naturally is just through the roof, isn't it?
Absolutely, and you're right. As soon as your child goes into senior school, you've got to take away some of your um, sort of cotton wool that you wrap them
Mm.
in. You've got to take away some of your sort of protective natures, and you've got to let them flourish a little bit. But if you've just navigated primary school and there's been anxiety-fueled conversations week in, week out, all that that's going to do is just cause you more anxiety, and the pressure's on for everyone. And I think that is felt. It's nerve-wracking. It's nerve-wracking without SEN, and then you add SEN in, and everything gets amplified again. And it's really, really challenging. So yeah, again, that is about, where possible, building strong, solid relationships. We often talk about find your tribe, find other people in similar situations to yourself, talk to your peers and speak to them. What are they doing that's working? What's helping? Are there any schools that could be recommended? Visiting those places and getting comfortable and talking to your child about what would work, what would make you feel safe. How can we help you to feel safe? Largely
Yeah.
doing a lot of the same conversations and same battles that you've done previously, and being that huge advocate for your child, basically, and just
Yeah.
finding any way possible to continue to do that.
Yeah, exactly. So if you have got the school and you're looking to transition, I do something called a map meeting. So it's like a person around a team around the child kind of meeting, really. And we talk about what the dream would be like, what the dream transition would be like, what the nightmare transition would be like, and everything in between. What can we do to make this more the dream than the nightmare? What things need to be put in place? And we do it at around spring, ahead of the July. So that last term, we can be fully
Mm,
prepared of what does the child need, what does the parent need, what do the next teachers need, in order for this to be much more like the dream scenario that we all speak about than the nightmare. And we reflect on the past, and we like imagine the future. And it's a really, really lovely meeting. And I find what happens, and the children are invited as well if they want to be. And what happens is the parents come with all this fear and anxiety, and they leave with a plan. It doesn't mean that the anxiety is not there anymore. It just means that they feel like maybe they've got a bit more control over it,
yeah.
and that everybody, it is not just them holding that. It's we've divvied out the jobs, we've got a
Mm,
plan in place, and to hope for the best transition that we could possibly do, because it is a huge thing for the children. So that's
yeah.
something that we do, and I implore you. And I've got a training PowerPoint all about it, actually. So if you want that, then I'll include that in the notes below. All about that kind of meeting, because it's quite a structured meeting, and it is incredibly helpful. However, I've also had some students who have received the not their choice school, and not even one that they've even put as their top 3 schools. And I've also had students that haven't had a school at all, and now they're in their second year of still waiting for their secondary school placement. So I'm also aware that there are parents that also might want to come to you that
Mm,
don't even have a school that they can be anxious about. There just is no answers, due to lack of provision, suitable provision.
yeah.
Do you get that in February as well?
Yeah, unfortunately we do. There's an awful lot of parents that come to our advice centres and say, my local authority have said that in our area there are no places, there are no spaces at all for my child. Um, we then offer advice and guidance, and I won't go into the advice and guidance
No,
because,
but they can
um,
contact you if they need it.
yeah, absolutely. And yeah, we talk them through what are the next steps, how can they approach this, and what can they do? What what measures can they put in place to try and get a provision set? But yeah, it's horrific, and again, it's just adding that anxiety, and particularly for a young person that needs kind of those safe boundaries, those routines, that
Yeah,
knowledge and that awareness to be able to feel safe, and you're not even giving them a
yeah.
named school. It's quite terrifying. So yeah, we offer advice and guidance on how to navigate that and how to kind of push forward to get the right answers there.
That's amazing. That's really helpful. And you mentioned that you have walk-in support. Is that based in a particular area of the UK, or is
Um,
that UK
Yeah,
wide?
so when I first stepped into the role, a lot of Sossen's work was quite South-centric. So we had centres in Waterloo, we've got Aldershot, Worcester Park, the Richmond areas, Hampton Court. So it was very much kind of based there. My aim has been to expand our physical presence as a charity. So in the last year, we've opened centres in Birmingham, Bristol, um, Canterbury. We last week we launched one in Essex in Chelmsford. Next week we are launching one in Westminster. The idea is for us to continue to grow our physical presence, because we know how important that is. If I could wave the magic wand, I would have an advice centre at least in every major city in England. But my team have told me I have to take it slow.
One day that it will be needed. Well, actually, hopefully it won't be needed is the plan. And then the
Yes,
second thing is maybe if it is needed, then hopefully you do that. So
exactly.
if people aren't near one, which is amazing that you have so many, but if people aren't near one, is it call support and online support that they can access?
Yeah, so it's we've got we've got the helpline service that they can call. Again, when I first took on the charity, we were open around about 10 hours a week on average. We're now up to 35 hours a week during term time that we're open and that they can speak to an advisor. We often advise people to have a look at our Facebook because that will constantly promote when our opening hours are. Uh, and they can call our advice centres, our advice line, and they can get sort of support through that. And on our website as well, you've also got email support. So if you reached out to us, you can present your sort of like your challenge at the moment via email, and then within sort of a few days, one of our advisors will come back to you on email. So we've got a whole host of other ways that people can access that support, and there's no limit to it either. So if a family were to call the helpline today, they could call it again tomorrow, and in a year. Same as an advice centre, they can just they. We see some advice centres, a family will come back month after month because they're just getting that next step and next step.
Mhm.
So there's no limit to the support that we'll offer. The only limitations we have is volunteer availability, basically.
Yes, of course. How do you fund all this incredible work? How can we support it? But also, how do you keep going? How do you keep developing? Um, yeah, it's
It's a great question. So it's for a range of things. So for some of our services, so the document writing services, we do
Mhm.
charge a small fee for those services. On average, our fees are around about 10% of what a solicitor would charge for them. I must hasten to add, if ever cost will never be a barrier. So if a family speak to us and say we can't afford this, we've got measures that we put in place. Cost won't ever stop a service, but we derive an income from that. We have a charity shop in Worcester Park that does really, really well. And that has sort of subsidised an awful lot of the free services that we've been able to offer. In addition to that, we've been very successful in winning some funding from a couple of really reputable organisations that have supported us and continue to support us, and donations as well. So it's been through those sort of measures that's allowed us to operate and now grow, basically.
Yeah, amazing. Oh, I'm so pleased that we've spoken to you. I can just feel that parents, I now have somewhere to send parents, because as a teacher, sometimes like I'm not their teacher in their class, right? So I can only say what I would do, which is really difficult then when I don't know the situation. So to have a charity that I can forward them to give them
Mm,
that bit of hope, that bit of advice, practical advice that can actually help me, the face to face or on the phone, is incredibly helpful.
brilliant. Yeah, no, and anything that we can do, we absolutely will. We are in that beautiful stage as a charity where we are growing, we are expanding, but we are still at the right size where people have a direct line of communication straight through. And I'm not saying this from a hierarchical perspective, but they have a line to the chief exec of this charity where they can talk to me and I can have a real conversation and say, if that's not a service we offer, why not? What else can we do? And I think that that's that beautiful moment of we are always able to tap into what do our families need. My ethos since I've joined, and that will always remain, is all I care about is helping those families to help that child. So any decision that I'm making, any meeting that I'm going to, all I care about is, will this effectively help more families? If the answer is no, I'm not going to the meeting. I'm not
Yeah, it's a
interested.
waste of time. Yeah.
Absolutely. All that I want to do and all that the team I work with want to do is help more families. That's our measure of success. And eventually the measure of success is that we won't be needed.
Yeah,
But
right.
for as long as we are needed, the measure of success is everyone that needs our help. Are we able to answer that call? Can we help them? So anything that we can do, we want to do more of.
It just sounds amazing. I'm so pleased that you exist.
Thank
I
you.
really am. I usually use these podcasts. I usually give myself a bit of homework after these chats. And there was something really relevant that you said that kind of hit a chord with me, as to that you've mentioned about the interview, making them as accessible as possible, sending the questions out ahead of time. And there's that lovely analogy, isn't there, of when there's snow and the caretaker wipes, clears the stairs first and then does the ramp, where actually if they started with the ramp, everyone could have still gotten in rather than waiting.
Yeah.
So it's that beautiful analogy, isn't it, of like start with accessible first and then everybody can access. And that's definitely something I'm going to take with me this week, making this podcast more accessible. I easily could have sent you the questions ahead of time before this, and you may not have needed it, but you may have done. And like you said, it just makes for that better interview, it makes for that better experience. So thank you for that beautiful reminder of that. Just because I'm not at school doesn't mean that this can't be accessible too. So yeah, I really appreciate that lovely reminder.
No,
For people listening,
that's
where
great.
can they find you? Where can they find out more?
The absolute best place will be our website, which is sossen.org.uk. We use it as an outwardly facing site, so it's got a lot of information. There's some booklets, information packs that you can download, and it will also list all of the support that we offer. So that's the best place to reach out to us.
Amazing. I'll leave that in the description as well, below, so that you don't even need to look for it. You can just tap
Amazing.
on by and find it. And if you don't need it, then maybe a colleague or a friend does. So maybe save this or save their account information so that you've got it, so that inevitably when you have that conversation with a friend on a bus or at the school gates, that you've got something that you can help them with. I think is probably good advice.
Yep, that's great advice. I love that.
Thank you so much for joining me, Richard. This has been incredibly helpful.
Thank you so much for having us. It's so lovely to be able to talk to you and to share our story with your listeners as well. So thanks for having us.